I had some issues from the last lecture that I didn't finish up, and so I'm going to take a moment to finish talking about Weber. And the really important point that I was trying to make, ready to make, almost got to make, is that for Weber, not only are class, status, and political party different bases on which people form groups, and they don't always line up. So I'm actually going to draw my picture of society again, whoops, which if you'll remember was this big circle with just this amazing hodgepodge. And these lines are meant to show lines of cleavage, that is division between workers and owners on two sides of one line. Different ethnic groups who might be not all poor, not all rich, that would divide up the world differently. Other kinds of classes and so forth. There are little divisions within elites about who's from which kind of rich or old family and so forth. But he also, so it's not only that you can have lots of divisions that go in lots of directions, so what any given person or even group will do is very contingent. That means it's dependent on the particular circumstances at a particular historical moment. That's first point. But the second thing is that Weber has this very deep way of thinking about the relationship between status and class, or between party and class. And that is that the commitments you make at any one time, whether they are commitments to a belief system or a group, endure and have lasting consequences long after the circumstances in which you made those commitments. And you can think of it as pertaining to everything from who you happen to fall in love with when you're 22, who ends up being a lifelong influence, even if by the time you were 45 you wouldn't have chosen that person if you met her or him again, to the beliefs you form. And Weber is particularly interested in the way in which the beliefs people form, the way I would put it is they have a life of their own, and they have influences that transcend, that go far beyond what people initially imagined. And status beliefs are particularly important in this way. I used a kind of superficial example of status claims, the kind where you say, oh, you know, my body is more buff than yours and I'm cooler, or I wear more interesting hairdo or have better earrings or whatever. But the really important status claims are the ones about forms of moral and style of life superiority. That's what Weber says. They are claims to honor. And those claims often require that the people who are making those claims make sacrifices. So, for example, if you believe that part of being elite is that you behave in an ethical way, and you claim that people who are from your elite background are superior because they have such refined sensibilities, because they're so generous, because they're so honorable, then maybe when it comes time to struggle for ownership of a corporation, you're just not very suited to do it, because you think it would be dishonorable to lie, to get down and dirty, to coerce somebody into doing something that you know is not in their interest. And so your beliefs about your status group, there's a term for this, noblesse oblige, the obligation of the nobility, can actually weaken your ability to win conflicts. And this comes up particularly strongly when an elite has claimed that the way you get into the elite is to have certain superior characteristics. And then they face the reality, which is that some people who were not born into that elite have those superior characteristics, whether it's intelligence or refinement of manners, or highly developed aesthetic sense, the ability to tell beautiful music from less beautiful music, one I happen to lack completely, and that I think has a big genetic component, so it's actually hard for classes to completely monopolize. That is, having a great ear, having perfect pitch, is not something you can force your children to have by educating them well. Some people have it and most people don't have it. So, if you stick by your guns in terms of status group claims, and you don't just say, oh, no, 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 what I meant is really that if you're rich and powerful, your kids deserve to be rich and powerful, and so we didn't mean it about being superior morally or aesthetically or anything. We just, if you don't go that direction, and Weber says it's very difficult to go that direction, then you can be in a situation where, and this has happened, it's a fascinating story and nobody has talked about it because it's so obviously, well, I'll explain the story and then I'll tell you why it's weird, which is white native-born American families in the US. Look at you. Look how few of you in this classroom are from those families. Now, those families controlled the political levers of California, and yet the University of California, like most other American institutions, at some point was forced to face the reality that especially Asian American kids, but lots of other kids were scoring better on tests and making better grades in high school than their kids. And they stood back, not because they're noble, but because they bought in 100% to the merit theory of how people get ahead. And at some level, they couldn't say, well, I don't care if all those Asian kids have more merit than my kids. I'm just not going to let them into the university. So up until about 1980, I'm not sure really of the date, there was actually a quota of sorts for Asian kids of Asian ancestry, and it was about 20%. And then my colleague and your faculty member, Jerry Karabell, wrote a very important report. You can look it up online, the Karabell report, that analyzed UC Berkeley's admissions policies and showed that highly qualified Asian kids of Asian ancestry were being turned down. And it was, you know, there was some theory, I mean, the kids studied too hard and so they weren't broad enough or something like that. But it was ridiculous. And so he, a white American of Jewish ancestry as it happens, wrote a report saying this is completely unfair and we shouldn't do it anymore. And the percentage of Asian kids went from about 20% to about 45%. And so this is status group politics. What are the criteria of value by which people get ahead? And groups fight to define those criteria. They always do. So there is, the one I know best is the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith that tries to make sure that anti-Semitism doesn't rear its ugly head in America. But the NAACP not only tries to fight for particular political things, but it tries to fight for the status claims of African Americans, that they fought in the Revolutionary War, that they fought heroically in the Civil War, that they contributed the Tuskegee Airmen, the exclusion of blacks from baseball, and their eventual, the Jackie Robinson story. There is an equivalent group for Italian Americans, Irish Americans. There is an anti-defamation league for Arab Americans who right now really need it, right? So every group is fighting to have its status claims raised, but the arguments about what we should value, what characteristics of people make them good, the idea that it's important to do activities in high school and to be well-rounded, all these are status group claims, right? That is what they are. And Weber's brilliance is to see that those status group claims can come into conflict with people's narrow class interests. And in fact, they almost inevitably do come into conflict because over time, whatever the group said about itself when it was on the rise, about how its claim to fame was its aesthetic refinement or its high test scores or its, entrepreneur, whatever the claim was, eventually somebody else is going to be as good at that or better. And so for Weber, class, status, and party are really different kinds of interests that have different, what I would call cultural or moral logics. I'll just make a small point about party because that always gets it comes right at the end. He spends one paragraph, not very important. But he's making the same kind of point, which is you might, or your group might, align with a certain political party early on because it serves your interests, your economic interests, your status group interests. It's the party that's going to get you ahead. But over time, the party changes under you. Think about Susan Collins. Anybody know who she is? Senator. She's a liberal Republican senator from Maine. And trust me, her life has been a living hell for the last 10 years because the Republican Party has shifted under her feet. I mean, another example is Richard Lugar, a great senator from Indiana, I think, who got defeated in the primaries in this election. And these are people who ended up being too liberal for their party. But switching party is very difficult. You have a huge investment in your party winning. If your party loses, then you can't chair any Senate committees, you can't get any legislation through. So even if your party no longer represents your exact political views, any of you active in ASUC? Oh my God. And this is a sociology? Okay, good, wonderful. I mean, how can you ever learn anything about the way the world works if you never participate in politics? Oh my God, terrible. Okay, but my point here is your party, you will have a commitment to your party having power because you need power to get other things done. You can't get things done without access to power, even if over time your party becomes less and less well aligned with your interests. So again, in Weber's model, it's inevitable that your interests on one dimension will come into conflict with your interests on another dimension, and this is especially powerful with respect to status groups because status groups make, as do parties sometimes, make arguments, have ideas about why their group is good, and those ideas have consequences. So remember that, because we're going to talk more about Weber. I know you can't believe anything so delightful is coming, but we're going to talk more about Weber and Weber's theory of ideas later in the course. Okay, now Marx, so switch gears, switch gears. Now, in terms of the theorists we have read, Marx actually wrote the earliest, historically, even though we're discussing him last. And one reason it's good we're discussing him last is because his theory is very, very complicated. But just let me tell you that it is also, he is the, what can I say, the most unified thinker. That is, there is a single, consistent, powerful argument underlying basically every word he writes. And once you have the key to unlock that argument, things that seemed incomprehensible when you first read them will seem clear and often just amazingly insightful. So I want you to get to the point, you don't have to become a Marxist, but you definitely should come to appreciate what is fantastic about this guy's thinking. Okay, so Marx has a dialectical theory of history, and I'm going to talk about this word, dialectical, but you need to memorize it. So figure out how to spell it, figure out how to say it, and you can use it cocktail party, chatter, perfect. Oh, that's very dialectical. Person will be so, what? Okay, so use it to defeat others in status group conflict. Okay. Now, I made that myself. Well, with the help of Microsoft, so there it is. The wonders of capitalism let me create a slide to talk about Marxism. It's amazing. Okay, I pointed out for each theorist that the first thing you want to understand to read them intelligently, and this is pretty much true for anything you ever read, maybe except poetry and novels, is what is the person's question? What is the question this person is asking? And Marx is not really asking a question about group formation. He is really asking a question about historical transformation. What are the forces that drive historical change? That's what he wants to know. So this is a macro, meaning very large scale, theory of historical transformation. And it has a few implications for how groups will form. But that is not the core of his interest. The core of his interest is what he thought of as the laws of history. And he wants to understand how history changes. And it is a dialectical theory of change. So I'm going to very briefly have a short excursus into what dialectical means. Marx got this idea from the philosopher Hegel, H-E-G-E-L, Georg Wilhelm Hegel, who was a German philosopher, and actually Marx was trained as a philosophy student, and he was part of a group, you don't have to write any of this down, called Young Hegelians. And the little section you're reading, which will drive you nuts, from the German ideology, is his attempt to break with Hegelian thinking. So I'll just say it's a sort of polemic against the Young Hegelians. Okay, but what is the part that Marx drew from Hegel that remained key to his thinking for his entire life? It was the notion of the dialectic. And put very simply, the dialectic is the idea that any idea, from Hegel's point of view, can generate its opposite. So if you can think of good, the word good, then you can think of not good or evil. So the very existence of the idea of good makes it possible to think of the opposite of that idea, right? And so you could say ideas generate their opposites. And then for Hegel, over history, ideas and their opposites come into conflict, and out of that conflict springs some new superior element. And so the thesis is the thing you start with, its opposite is the antithesis, and the new thing that comes out of the conflict, so it would be better if I had a little jagged line there with knives or something showing conflict. So the thesis and the antithesis come into conflict, and that conflict produces this new thing, which in Hegelian terminology is the synthesis. Now, let me give you one tiny, sort of more concrete example, which comes, I believe, from Hegel's philosophy of mind, which is one of his works. And he starts with the notion of a kind of primitive, like a baby, a person. And that thing, I want to hold off on calling it a self, because for him it isn't yet a self. That primitive bundle of needs comes into opposition with the world, because it can't get those needs met. It's hungry, it's thirsty, it's wet, and the world out there does not meet its needs. So its needs come into conflict with the opposite of those needs, with resistance or denial, and trust me, as a parent, you do not meet a baby's needs. You know, even if you meet them 90% of the time, there is complete hysteria for no apparent reason the other 10% of the time, and nothing you can do. So his notion is that you come as a primitive kind of undeveloped creature, you come into conflict with what is not you. So all that exists for a baby, he says, is you. But the baby is forced to come into conflict with not you, not me. So you, and eventually that conflict, as it intensifies, becomes other. There's an other out there. There's you and your parent, say, or you and others. And the point is, you're in conflict because they have needs and you have needs. And not everybody's needs can be satisfied all the time. Trust me, the mother has to go pee even if the baby is screaming. I mean, this is a simple, really simple, primitive aspect of human experience. But his notion is that this conflict between you, your you-ness, your narcissistic, only I exist, and other can produce a new synthesis, which is the recognition that the other is also a self, like you, right? And you're just at the right age to understand that about your parents, right? That they're not just the people who say, no, you can't go to that party, no, you can't bring that friend home, no, you can't stay up all night, no, you can't eat all your Halloween candy, no, you can't do this. That person is also a self. And his point is, you can't have a self until you have recognized other selves. What it means to be a self is to recognize the general category of selfness. Otherwise, you can only be this primitive bundle of needs. So the conflict between you and other, in his terms, can produce this higher order thing, which is an actual self that can recognize itself and the existence of other selves. So it's that sense of a dialectic. There's a force in history. Now we're moving from ideas to Marx's interest, which were materially based forces in history. And that force in history, and I'll describe what those forces are, generates its opposite. That's extremely important for Marx. That opposition becomes a huge conflict. In Marx's terms, it becomes a revolution. And that revolution produces a new system at a higher level. Okay? So thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's the dialectic. Now, let's see how that actually works out in Marx's, Marx's historical analysis. And I know this looks like a very dense slide for me, but I have pictures to follow, so you're going to see. I have illustrations. Okay. So the basic argument then of Marx is that every historical era is characterized by a mode of production. And a mode of production, and this is so important, is a way of organizing human cooperation. So he has a wonderful chapter I didn't assign, but it's part of the book Capital, which is hugely critical of capitalism, left, right, and center, and it's the chapter called Cooperation. And one of his points about capitalism is that it's a very highly developed mode of social cooperation, right? You've got this elaborate division of labor. So every mode of production is a form of social cooperation that actually allows people to produce their material life. So he points out that they produce, and this is the language you'll see in your reading, they produce their own life, meaning enough to sustain themselves and enough to reproduce more human life and more labor. So one way to think about it is they support themselves and they support their children in the process of having children. So they reproduce their social life. They reproduce also just things like their schools or their churches, or that is, they reproduce their whole life. Human beings do this. And they do it in different ways in different periods of history. And each of those ways of producing what human beings need and reproducing their life together is a form of cooperation that he calls a mode of production. And just to anticipate where we're going in the next lecture, so I want this to just sink in. Every mode of production is a form of cooperation, and simultaneously, this is the dialectical part. At the same time, it's not two different things, it's the same thing. It is also a mode of exploitation or oppression. So just in a very simple sense, let's think about it. If you have, it's a mode of cooperation and a mode of exploitation. And if you think about this, sometimes, somewhere, I'm not sure it's in the part of the German ideology you're reading, but he says, look, the first division of labor is the division of labor between men and women. In the primitive, he doesn't quite say cave person days, but that's really what he's thinking. You know, some primitive band back in the dawn of human history had a division of labor between male people and female people. And that was a form of cooperation. Probably the man went off and hunted and the woman stayed behind and took care of a baby and dug up plants, something like that. And that was a form of cooperation. And it was, how do you think that cooperation came about in Marx's understanding? Well, it didn't come about because they sat down and talked about it and decided it'd be really good for them each to do what they were good at. It came about because, in essence, caveman A whacked cavewoman B over the head and said, you do this. And that is how the division of labor evolved for most of human history. One group conquered another and said, you'll be our slaves, and so you'll till the fields while we boss you around. And that is, for Marx, both cooperation and exploitation. They are the same thing. A mode of production contains both those things. Okay, and so the Marxist terminology for a mode of production says that modes of production are made up of two elements. The forces of production, which is how people are organized to actually produce things, and the social relations of production. Now, this is often misunderstood in a really serious way, so I want you to avoid the misunderstanding. Forces of production are not just things like machinery. They include things like that, what kind of plow you use, what kind of machines you have for production. But they also include everything involved in how you actually produce. So, for example, if you have, as some parts of medieval Europe did, a system where you divide up the fields and different families or different people have different strips of each field, and so there's one field that's hilly and one field that's flat, and so you divide each one into 5 strips, and each family gets a strip of the flat field and, or the well-watered field or whatever, and a strip of the field up in the mountains, and they cooperate at harvest time, say, or something like this. That is part of the forces of production. That is that form of ownership, that form of traditional claims to land, that form of deciding who gets access to the water. That is part of how people actually produce, and so it's part of the forces of production. If people's children follow them into the fields to, throw the grain into the furrow after the parents have plowed the furrow, that's part of the forces of production. The social relations of production are all the other, what we would call social institutions, that keep that system of production running. They are things like the laws, the religion, the culture, the political system. So the social relations of production are those larger, again, I'll use the term institutions, which Marx never used, and in fact, I would say has a very weak theory of institutions, but anyway, they are those larger systems that keep the whole mode of cooperation working. Okay, so you've got the forces of production, which are how production is actually organized, and the social relations of production, which are the larger structures of, again, law, government, religion, cultural belief, and so forth. Now, classes, and this is important for Marx, are the active agents. Well, let me turn this around just a minute. So, when Marx's basic model, and here I've got to draw society again. It's really good I have art skills. That's a joke. Okay. Which we're going to discuss in a minute. Is that in every mode of production begins to produce its opposite within it. In a dialectical process, as the mode of production succeeds, it creates new forces of production within it. So remember, the old mode of production has forces of production, social relations of production. As it succeeds, new forces of production grow up within the old one. Any of you ever taken cell biology? Okay, you can kind of think of this as a cell and these little colonies as virus or something. And as those new forces of production that are created within the old mode of production grow, they become stronger and stronger until the old social relations of production, which were helpful in keeping the old system running, come into conflict with these new forces of production that are organized differently than the old ones, and those new forces of production, I'm going to put some detail in this in a minute, grow more and more powerful until they can't be contained by the old social relations of production. The old social relations of production are getting in the way. They're keeping these new forces of production that are increasingly powerful from really expanding enough, and the new forces of production burst apart the fetters. So that word is in Marx, and you need to know a fetter is a thing that ties you up. So it's a rope or a binding, like what I was wearing around my shoulder last week, but I got to take it off. Okay, and eventually the fetters are burst asunder. That's burst apart by the power of these new forces of production. And the actual conflict between these old social relations of production and the new forces of production growing up within the old is in fact a conflict also of, we'll talk about this in detail in a minute, a conflict between two conflicting ways of life, but it's also a conflict between two classes, right? The classes that are key to organizing the new forces of production, and the classes that are committed to the old social relations of production. Now, I'm going to talk about the specific model of this, the way Marx thinks about it with respect to medieval feudalism, because a lot of his thinking has to do with his image of how capitalism grew up within feudal society. So I'm going to show you something really scary. I think it's here. And I didn't actually check to see if it all, just a sec, fits on, yeah, there it is, whoops. Okay, so you don't actually have to memorize this, but this is a very, very crude sort of time scale of Western European history. And so pretty much, and I didn't get this from Marx, I partly got it from this great theorist or historian, Mark Bloch, who wrote a book called Feudal Society, and you want to read something really great, oh my God. It's the best. Most sociological history was written in 1942, 44, during World War II. The guy was a great medieval historian. He didn't have any books. He was cut off from all sources. And so he wrote it basically out of his deep, deep knowledge as a sort of synthetic understanding. And then he was killed by the Nazis, actually. Okay, so you have first feudal age, then you have population growth, a little bit of growth of cities, sort of development of a little bit of trade, then you get the High Middle Ages, then you start to get real capitalism, then you have two big revolutions, the English Revolution and the French Revolution, and then you get industrial society. That's crudely what Marx is drawing on in his thinking. Okay, so how did he think this worked? And here I'm going to go back because I know a lot of you might not even know how much you know about feudalism. Okay, so feudalism, and this is a horrible slide, but it's because they didn't have cameras then. So these are mostly things like tapestries that don't photograph very well, or some kind of drawings or something. But there you see a castle, you see people tilling the soil, and then in just a second you're going to see the other major actor there, which is knights. Okay, armor. So when you go to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, one of the great things, they have an amazing collection of armor, including all this medieval armor. And so all those things you love, all those stories like, oh, the hobbits and this and that, and what's the thing with the, oh, I don't know. Now my pop culture knowledge is escaping me since I never had any. But okay, so knights and lords and ladies and all that, that's feudalism, okay? And the basic way the feudal mode of production worked, and this is actually true, not just in storybooks, is that it depended on a huge mass of unfree labor. And those were the serfs, who were hereditary, unfree, they weren't slaves, they were hereditary, unfree peasants who were attached to the land. So if you were a lord and you acquired a piece of land, you acquired it with its serfs. And they were obligated to live on the land and to share what they grew with their lord. So they owed the lord, I don't know, a portion of their grain and a portion of the grapes they grew for wine and a portion of whatever else meat they raised and so forth. So you have these laborers who cannot leave the land, and they're peasants, but they're not free peasants, they're unfree. And you have lords above them, and the way this system worked is that those lords were crucial because that gave them enough wealth to arm themselves. The fact that they could extract a surplus from the produce of the peasants allowed them to arm themselves, and that allowed them to defend the land and actually the peasants against marauders, against raiders, against robbers, against barbarian hordes. So if we go back to this picture of Europe, do this just quickly, this. During the first feudal age, Europe was invaded by foreigners who were considered barbarians from every side. It was attacked from the north by the Vikings, these people from the Norsemen, the people from Norway and so forth, who came down the coast in their ships, landed on the shores of France, Spain, raided the countryside, ravaged things, stole the grain. That was how, what we would call piracy of a very dramatic sort. And they kidnapped people for ransom, and Europe was powerless to prevent this. From the east, there were the hordes of basically what became the Magyars, the Hungarians. And they were raiding from the east, and they were pillaging, plundering, raping, burning, stealing, kidnapping, murdering. And from the south were the Muslims, the Saracens. And they were coming up through Portugal, which they conquered, and through part of Spain. And from the 7th century on, they were marauding and pillaging and plundering. So Europe was flattened. These really were the Dark Ages because it was an unbelievably backward time, because they just couldn't militarily protect themselves. And so feudalism, this system of armed knights who depended on the labor of serfs for the wealth that allowed them to arm themselves, and a very complex system of loyalty. So each armed knight was the vassal of a lord above him, and he was the vassal of a lord above him. And that system of loyalty allowed people to gather enough men to fight. Right? So you were a high lord, you had some vassals, they each had some men under them, and men were useless if they weren't armed. And it was very, very expensive to arm people. To make a suit of armor in these backward societies was really expensive. So, to keep this, you built these huge castles. You wanted people to be able to farm outside the castle and not to spend their whole lives locked up in the castle gates, terrified of the people who were assaulting them. So you developed this system of feudal homage, and this is a vassal swearing loyalty to his lord. These were the most intense bonds people had, actually. They loved their lord. They swore on Bibles. Each man placed his hands inside the hand of his lord, knelt like this, and became the man of his lord. So these were powerful, powerful forms of loyalty. Japan, by the way, also had a feudal system. It's the only other place that had true feudalism. There is a king and his vassals. So there they are again bowing, and probably he's giving a sword to the knight. And there are knights in battle, and we have many pictures and images of that. And again, it still shapes a lot of our popular culture, even the science fiction type popular culture. And there are serfs harvesting the grain. Now, this system here, then, is that within this feudal society, as it began to succeed, so the ability to extract grain from the serfs actually was successful. And so over this period, so now I'm going to go back to my little ridiculous chronology. That's what it is, chronology. From about the year 1000 on, feudalism began gradually to drive out the barbarians, so that by about 1150 or 1200, Europe is no longer threatened. They get rid of the last fortresses on the coast of France that these barbarians used to park themselves on the coast and just raid the countryside. Then their boats would come by and ship the grain back to where they came from. They would take hostages. It was just like the Somali pirates on the Somali coast, except the Somali pirates are from a very poor backward place. These guys were tromping all over Europe. Europeans were backward. And actually the Arab civilizations were very high civilizations. I mean, this is a period when the world looked very, very different. So by about 1150, 1200, Europe is pacified. That leads to enormous economic growth. More land can be cultivated. There is a big increase in population because people aren't being driven off their fields all the time. They're not having their grain stolen. So you get more and more land under cultivation, bigger and bigger population, and lo and behold, you start to get some trade and some production of luxury goods for these increasingly wealthy courts, so that the knights start to have better and better armor. The ladies in the courts start to become a status group, and all of the knights become nobility. They, as a status group, they want to show they're superior. So they don't just want armor. They want beautiful clothing, laces. They want beautiful porcelain, tableware. They want knives and forks. They start to become actually more civilized. And that generates trade. So here, now we're back to this picture. Think of all this part as serfdom, as feudalism, and these little things growing up inside it are what? They are the little centers of trade and artisan manufacture. That is, a blacksmith who's really good at making armor becomes famous for the quality of his swords in the entire area, a little workshop on someone's estate where they make very beautiful cloth, and you start to get cloth merchants, and you start to get actually things like water wheels and stuff that people can use as forms of power, and you can start to manufacture, not in our modern sense, but you can start to manufacture things like shoes from leather and armor and fabric and so on and so forth. So these centers of trade and commerce start to grow, and then they are constrained by the old social relations of production. So I'm going to try to speed through this argument because it's really important, but here I want to show you medieval artisan, that's not a real one, that's a fake one, a blacksmith, and a medieval town. So then you begin to get these market towns growing within feudal society. Now the question is, why isn't this just progress? Why, in Marx's sense, does it have to produce revolution? Why is it dialectical? Why does it generate conflict? Why isn't this just a smooth transition from feudalism to capitalism? And the reason is because the new forces of production, this trade and manufacturing, come into conflict with the old social relations of production. What does that mean? I'm going to try to quickly say land, labor, and capital, the basic features, the basic ingredients of any economy. What is land under feudalism? Well, the most important thing about it is it comes with these serfs on it. And they aren't free, but you, the lord, are not free to sell the land. In fact, nobody owns the land. It is controlled by the immediate lord of those serfs, but he in turn is a vassal to a higher lord, and ultimately to the king. And everyone has some claims on that land, and nobody owns it. Can't be bought and sold. There actually is no property in the sense of buyable and sellable property. So if you are a manufacturer and you want to buy a piece of land to put a factory on, or more important, if you are a farmer and you want to start commercial agriculture that can feed all those people in the cities, you can't do it. Those serfs had the right to stay on the land. You can't push them off the land. And in fact, the enclosure movement, which was the attempt to do that, caused huge riots and enormous conflict. What about labor? Labor was not free. So people in the cities who wanted to hire workers couldn't hire them because they were runaway serfs. And lords would come back and try to get their serfs. And cities would have to pay basically a bounty to keep the people who were free workers in the city free. That is, these two systems of social relations are fundamentally in conflict. The feudal world did not have free labor. The capitalist world required free labor in order to grow. You had to be able, you're growing here, you need to hire workers, and you can't get workers, and if you do get them, some feudal lord comes and claims them back, because under feudal law, they have to stay on the land. And finally, capital. There's no such thing as capital in feudalism. There is wealth, enormous wealth, and that wealth is spent on demonstrating the status of the lord and keeping all his followers, his retainers, his vassals happy. And in fact, it's considered demeaning. Lords don't work. They parade around being incredibly important. So capitalism requires capital that can be invested for a profit. And in fact, as you might know, the medieval church regarded profit as usury. It was illegal to make a profit on your money. It was disgusting in status terms to work, to loan money, to work for a living, to invest your money for profit was repellent to feudal society. So in these ways and many other ways, the emerging capitalist system couldn't blossom. It couldn't come into its own as long as it was trapped within the old social relations of production. So Marx says there had to be a revolution. The old fetters had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder. You find that passage, okay?